Hello. General Hospital today will reveal Alexis had long believed that justice was her compass, that truth, no matter how painful, would always be her North Star. But as she sat in her office, still trembling from the visit of Kai and Trina, that belief shattered like glass under the weight of a revelation too dark, too cruel to reconcile with the ideal she had built her entire life upon. In a world that she had fought to keep black and white, she now found herself engulfed in a blinding fog of betrayal, manipulation, and moral decay. When Kai and Trina arrived, their voices shaky but unwavering. They didn't come with mere gossip, they came bearing a truth so sharp it cut through Alexis's reality. Willow, the same young woman Alexis had stood up for in court, defended with every ounce of her credibility and legal intellect, was the one who had shot Drew. Not in a moment of panic or defense, not in an accident, but in cold calculation, masked beneath trembling hands and practiced innocence. Willow had fired that bullet, then wiped her tears, stepped into the courtroom, and allowed Alexis to become her champion, all while knowing she was lying. The betrayal ran deeper than Alexis could admit to anyone, even herself. She had thrown her reputation into the fire to protect Willow, convinced by her frailty, her trembling voice, her haunted expressions. Alexis had fought with conviction, woven arguments, dismantled evidence, painted Willow as a woman at the edge of ruin because she had believed in her. But that belief now rotted into something shameful, something horrifying. Willow had not only shot Drew, but had deliberately married him in the aftermath. A man who loved her, who saw her as a second chance at family, had been used as a human shield to bury her crime deeper beneath the surface. Alexis couldn't help but ask herself how much of the marriage had been orchestrated by Willow, how many steps ahead she had played, and whether this fragile girl had ever truly been broken at all, or if she had simply been hiding behind brokenness to mask the dark, festering motives within. And even more terrifying than the crime itself was what Alexis now understood about Willow's mind. There was no remorse behind her terror-streaked face. There was no instability that begged for healing. Behind Willow's carefully constructed mask, Alexis saw a chaotic void, pulsing with bitterness and vengeance. The look in her eyes wasn't just fear, it was calculation. She hadn't married Drew out of love. She had married him to silence the past, to control the future. And perhaps worst of all, Alexis feared that Willow believed she had done nothing wrong, that Drew deserved it. That pain was a currency to be spent at will. Still, despite this devastating awareness, Alexis chose silence, a choice she would never forgive herself for. She weighed every angle, every consequence, and made a decision not based on truth, but on fear. Fear of losing access to Scout. Fear of losing what little control she had left. Fear of admitting she had been manipulated by a woman she had considered fragile, even good. Fear of destroying what remained of her credibility if she reversed her stance, and condemned the very woman she had so forcefully defended. So Alexis stood before the court and painted a lie with the skill of a master. She defended Willow with conviction, burying the truth deeper beneath layers of legal nuance and emotional misdirection. Each word she spoke turned into a stone in her chest, heavy and suffocating. But she could not stop. She would see it through no matter the cost. What she didn't know was that Michael, watching from the shadows of the courtroom, had already begun piecing the puzzle together. The man Willow had once loved and betrayed was no longer the same. He was no longer the heartbroken boy clinging to the ruins of their past. He was a father now, a son, a man forged through disappointment and fire. And he had seen something in Willow, some sliver of truth she failed to conceal. Perhaps it was the way she flinched when Drew touched her. Perhaps it was the emptiness in her words. Perhaps it was just instinct. But Michael had followed that instinct, and it had led him to the truth. He gathered evidence not out of vengeance, but out of duty. Photographs, timestamps, surveillance clips, testimonies. The pieces came together slowly, painfully, but with terrifying clarity. And when he finally stepped forward in court, evidence in hand, he didn't flinch. Michael's testimony didn't tremble. His words were clean, precise, and devastating. He laid out the truth not with rage, but with resolve. The photographs showed inconsistencies in Willow's account. The ballistics pointed directly to her. A neighbor's security footage had caught the flash of a gun and the figure that fled, and it matched Willow's build and clothing. Even the handwriting on a discarded note hinted at premeditation. Michael presented it all, exposing not just the crime, but the careful, calculated cover-up that followed. The courtroom murmured with disbelief. Faces turned toward Willow, no longer filled with sympathy, but with suspicion. And Willow, as if prepared for this very moment, played her final card with a precision that stunned even Alexis. She announced her pregnancy. Her voice was quiet, trembling in all the right ways, and for a moment, the courtroom paused, morality held hostage by the idea of unborn life. Alexis felt the air escape her lungs as the trap snapped shut. She had defended a criminal, and now that criminal had become a mother-to-be. Everything changed in that instant. Public opinion, legal tactics, the sympathy that once hovered around Drew began to shift toward Willow again. A pregnant woman facing imprisonment. Michael's momentum faltered not from disbelief, but from sheer helplessness. He couldn't push further without becoming the villain. No matter how strong his evidence, no matter how loud his truth, the courtroom was no longer just debating a crime, it was judging a mother. Alexis sat frozen, her soul torn in two. She had lost control of the narrative. The truth, once hers to reveal, now danced in the hands of a woman capable of weaponizing life itself to escape justice. And in that moment, Alexis realized that what haunted her most wasn't just the crime, or the betrayal, or even her role in the charade. It was the dawning realization that she no longer knew where justice ended, and self-preservation began, and worse, that maybe she had never truly known at all. The air in the courtroom froze as if someone had sucked all the oxygen from the room. Time seemed to stop. Eyes widened, jaws clenched, and for a single suspended heartbeat, not even the sound of breathing could be heard. Alexis could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as the weight of the moment descended on her like a landslide. The floor beneath her felt unstable, as though it might crack wide open and swallow her whole. The world she thought she understood, the case she believed she had steered with calculated clarity, had just been derailed by 5 simple words. Willow was pregnant. The shock rippled through the courtroom like a thunderclap, sending a wave of gasps, whispers, and startled murmurs cascading across the rows of stunned observers. Even the judge, previously composed and dispassionate, blinked twice and leaned forward, as if trying to process the implications before reacting. But it was too late. Willow had already played the card that would alter the course of the proceedings. A card so powerful, so unassailable in the court of public opinion, that even the damning evidence Michael had presented now felt muted in comparison. Willow didn't shed tears. She didn't plead. She didn't need to. Her silence, her trembling hands cradling her abdomen, her sullen gaze lowered just enough to suggest humility, but high enough to hint at righteousness. This was her strategy, and it was brilliantly executed. The entire room had been blindsided, not because no one thought her capable of lies, but because this lie, if it was a lie at all, was so bold, so emotionally manipulative, so impeccably timed that it disarmed even the most skeptical minds. In a single move, Willow transformed herself from a potential criminal into a vulnerable mother-to-be, drawing the spotlight of empathy directly onto her, blurring the lines between guilt and grace. Michael, who just moments ago had stood tall, confident in the clarity of truth, found himself unraveling. The damning documents in his hands now felt like burdens. The photographs, the statements, the timeline he'd so painstakingly built, relics of a truth the room no longer wished to see. He stared at Willow, his face a mixture of disbelief, fury, and a painful kind of helplessness. He knew what she had done. He knew what she was capable of. But as he watched the court slowly recalibrate around the new narrative she had set, he realized the bitter truth. A pregnant woman, even one steeped in deception, held more sway in that courtroom than the facts ever could. Michael wanted to scream, to remind everyone that behind the pregnancy, if it even existed, was a woman who had fired a gun at Drew, who had married him under false pretenses, who had walked away from every consequence she'd ever faced. But the tide had shifted. The prosecution hesitated. Jurists glanced at one another nervously. Even the prosecutor fumbled his notes, as if unsure whether pressing forward would now make him the villain in the public's eyes. No one wanted to be the person who sent a pregnant woman to prison. Not in this town. Not under these lights. And so Michael, the one who had loved her once, the one who had lost everything at her hands, was left standing there with no one to hear him anymore. Not fully. Not the way they needed to. Even his anger began to wither beneath the complexity of the situation. Because beyond the lies, beyond the manipulation, there was still a child, a possible life forming inside the woman who had betrayed them all. And Michael, for all his pain, could not entirely separate himself from that truth. It was maddening. Meanwhile, across town, Drew remained confined to a hospital bed. The bullet long since removed, but the deeper wound just beginning to take shape. The physical trauma had been measurable, treatable, but the psychological one, the revelation that the woman lying beside him each night had not only deceived him, but possibly tried to kill him, was something medicine could not touch. The day he had first awoken in that sterile room, surrounded by beeping monitors and blurred faces, he had called for Willow. He had wanted her arms around him, her voice in his ear, whispering reassurance. Now, every memory of those moments turned his stomach. He replayed the weeks they had spent together after the shooting, the way she had cared for him, prepared his meals, laughed at his jokes. Every touch now felt like a trick, every kiss a calculated act. The realization that she had previously loved Michael, then discarded him for Drew, only to now be exposed as the one who tried to eliminate him, it was too grotesque to comprehend. What was he to her? A puppet? A shield? A victim meant to be disposed of once he outlived his usefulness? Drew's mind became a battlefield of betrayal. He didn't just feel deceived. He felt violated, manipulated at his most vulnerable. He saw now how every moment of tenderness had been weaponized. Her tears, once a source of comfort, now felt rehearsed. Her silence, once gentle, now echoed with withheld truths. The warmth he thought he had restored to his life was nothing more than the flicker of a false light, keeping him blind while she controlled the shadows. He hated himself most of all. For believing her. For loving her. For daring to think that he could rebuild his life with someone who, deep down, may have always seen him as disposable. He had offered her his heart, his home, his trust, and she had returned it all with betrayal sealed by a bullet. The betrayal poisoned everything. His memories. His hopes. Even his sense of reality. And now, to learn that she claimed to be pregnant, was it even true? Or another calculated move? Another mask layered over deceit? Drew couldn't cry. Not yet. He couldn't even scream. All he could do was lie there, bound not by his injuries, but by the realization that his life had been rewritten. By someone else's script, and that he had played the fool center stage, for an audience who may never know the truth. Meanwhile, Alexis stood at the heart of a storm no one else could see in its entirety. Outwardly composed, her breathing even, her shoulders square beneath the scrutiny of the courtroom. But within her, two opposing forces tore her apart. On one side was her identity as an officer of the law, the moral compass she had followed for decades, her duty to the truth, and the sacred responsibility to uphold justice without bias. That was the foundation upon which she had built her career, her reputation, her sense of self. But on the other side, quieter, more personal, and far more insidious, was her emotional bond with Willow. The years of mentorship, of shared vulnerabilities, of the subtle maternal instincts she had felt watching Willow battle illness, motherhood, heartbreak, and trauma. Alexis had invested herself in this young woman. She had believed in her, perhaps more deeply than she ever admitted, and now that belief threatened to drown her in shame. The knowledge that Willow had lied was no longer speculation, it was certainty. The moment Kai and Trina had laid bare the facts, Alexis felt her world pivot. But instead of bringing clarity, it only deepened the fog. She knew the rules. As a legal advocate, she was obligated to report perjury, to remove herself from cases where conflicts arose, to never knowingly present false testimony to the court. And yet, that's exactly what she had done. She had heard the truth and stayed silent. Worse, she had tailored her argument in court to obscure that truth, protecting Willow from the justice system she had once vowed to serve. And now, with the trial unraveling, and Michael's bombshell revelations flooding the courtroom, Alexis found herself no longer a mere player in this legal drama. She had become a subject of it. The weight of the eyes around her was unbearable. Some were cold and judging, others narrowed in confusion. But all of them were looking at her. She could feel it. A few jurors whispered under their breath. A court clerk scribbled something without raising their gaze. The prosecutor's brow furrowed with what might have been suspicion or disappointment. Alexis had walked into this courtroom to defend her client. But now she stood as a silent defendant, herself guilty not of the crime, but of knowing and concealing the one who had committed it. In their eyes, this was no longer Willow's trial. It had shifted almost imperceptibly into the moral and professional reckoning of Alexis Davis. And yet, even as the walls closed in, Alexis could not will herself to speak. Her mind ran through the cascade of consequences like dominoes. If she confessed, she would likely be disbarred. Her credibility, painstakingly earned over years, would be obliterated. Scout, the child she yearned to remain close to, might be taken from her life. Drew might never forgive her. The legal community would cast her out. Everything she had fought for would crumble. But if she stayed silent, she would live with the knowledge that she had become complicit in shielding someone capable of attempted murder. That she had allowed the system to be manipulated by emotion, deception, and theatrics. The cost of that silence was not just professional, it was existential. And still, the questions continued to multiply. Was Willow truly pregnant? Or was this a final, desperate bluff? Alexis couldn't be sure. The timing was too precise. The emotional impact too convenient. But even the possibility of a child complicated every legal avenue. If the pregnancy was real, the court would hesitate. The public would turn. Sympathy would flood social media. And Alexis, regardless of what she knew, would be branded the enabler of a woman they would either vilify or canonize, depending on which story gained traction first. Michael, despite his resolve, now stood at a threshold of his own. Was he prepared to go further? To press charges, to see Willow convicted, even if it meant her unborn child would suffer the consequences? Could he accept being painted as a man who tore apart a family, even if the family itself had been born out of betrayal and manipulation? He had the evidence, but evidence was no longer the battlefield. This war had moved into a territory ruled by perception, sympathy, and public narrative, and Drew, still recovering in a hospital bed, unaware of the full extent of the betrayal, was the ultimate pawn in this perverse game. What would happen when he discovered the entire truth? That the woman he had married had not only deceived him, but had plotted his death? That Alexis, his trusted friend and confidant, had known and said nothing? Would he spiral into rage, or simply break? Could he ever rebuild himself from such devastation? For Alexis, these weren't just hypotheticals. They were the ghosts already gathering at the edges of her conscience. The questions haunted her every breath. Could she live with her silence? Could she wake each morning knowing she had chosen fear over truth, loyalty over justice, protection over principle? Or would she, in some future moment of unbearable guilt, rise and confess knowing it would destroy everything she had worked for, everything she had loved, but might finally let her breathe? The trial wasn't over. The verdict had not yet been delivered. But Alexis already knew that no matter what the jury decided about Willow, her own fate had already been sealed by her choices, by her silence, by her inability to walk away from someone she should have never defended in the first place. Whether the child in Willow's womb existed or not, whether Drew healed or fell deeper into grief, whether Michael fought or surrendered, none of it would undo what Alexis had become. A prisoner of her own compromise. A woman who traded clarity for chaos in a moment she would replay forever. And somewhere in that courtroom, beneath the heavy silence that followed Willow's announcement, Alexis knew that she had not just lost a case, she had lost herself. The question, the one that no one dared voice aloud, still hung in the air like an oppressive mist, clinging to the courtroom walls, to the heavy silence between glances, to the shallow breaths of those who understood that what had just occurred was not an ending, but the ignition of something far more dangerous. It was not just a pause in legal proceedings or a dramatic twist in testimony. It was a shift in gravity, a tremor that signaled the true war had only just begun. The verdict, whatever it would be, could never contain the chaos that had already been unleashed. In Port Charles, a town where justice is often choked by the tangled roots of family loyalty and hidden vendettas, truth was never something pure or whole. It came in fragments, half glimpsed through stained glass, filtered through layers of secrecy and sacrifice. And now, with Willow's bombshell, a potential pregnancy wrapped in uncertainty and emotional manipulation, the battlefield had expanded. The courtroom had become only one front. The real conflict would bleed into homes, relationships, and lives, leaving no one untouched. Alexis, Michael, Drew each stood on the precipice of their own unraveling, pulled into different orbits of devastation, all connected by the lie that had been allowed to fester too long beneath the surface. The justice system might render its judgment, but in Port Charles, judgment is never final. It is rewritten in living rooms, whispered in hospital corridors, and carved into the legacy of those who dared to fight for the truth or silence it. What was to become of Alexis, torn between her oath and her guilt? Would she one day confess and sacrifice everything she had built? Or would she continue down a path of quiet complicity, knowing that her silence had already condemned her integrity? Would Michael, now thrust into the spotlight as both accuser and abandoned lover, find the strength to keep fighting in a war that had weaponized compassion itself against him? And Drew, recovering not just from a physical wound, but the emotional violation of betrayal, would he find justice? Or simply become another casualty in a town that feeds on secrets? But most pressing of all, was Willow truly pregnant? Or had she orchestrated the most cynical twist in a story already dripping with deceit? If the pregnancy was real, it would alter every moral calculation. If it was a lie, it was one that had already succeeded in silencing the voices that once shouted for justice. In Port Charles, the line between manipulation and survival was often indistinguishable, and Willow now walked it with terrifying precision. The silence that followed her revelation wasn't just shock, it was surrender. A collective pause as everyone, from the judge to the jurors to the spectators, reassessed their roles in the drama now unfolding. But even as the courtroom attempted to regain composure, there was an unspoken understanding that nothing could go back to the way it was. Too much had been revealed, and far more still lay buried beneath the surface. Because in Port Charles, nothing stays buried for long. The secrets here don't fade. They metastasize. One cover-up births another. One betrayal sparks another chain reaction. And while some bleed in private, others bleed publicly, their reputations shredded, their loyalties questioned. Those who chase the truth must often do so alone in darkness, knowing that the moment they speak, they may lose everything. The town has seen it before, good people destroyed by their pursuit of justice, while liars walk free behind carefully maintained masks. That is the cost of truth in Port Charles' blood. Not just metaphorical pain, but literal destruction. Reputations ruined. Families shattered. Lives endangered. Because here, truth is not a light that sets people free, it is a fire that consumes. And it will burn through everything unless someone, somewhere, is willing to be burned by it first. So the question remained, who would take that step? Who would walk willingly into the fire and demand that the truth be told, no matter the cost? Alexis had stood on the edge and stepped back. Michael had made his stand, but been rendered voiceless by sympathy's cruel twist. Drew, too wounded to fight, remained in limbo. And Willow, the woman at the center of it all, had seized control of the narrative once again. Her motives cloaked in innocence, her future cloaked in uncertainty. The gavel may have silenced the room, but it could not silence what had already begun. The war for truth in Port Charles was no longer theoretical. It was here. Quiet. Coiled. Waiting. And somewhere, someone would have to bleed for it. Because in this town, that is the only way secrets die.